Okay, so let's unpack this. There is a very specific historical itch that, well, it never seems to go away.
Hmm.
It's this constant urge to fix the church. It feels like every generation or so, a movement springs up and says, wait, hold on, we've got it wrong. We need to reboot.
Right. We need to get back to the original version.
Exactly.
It is a recurring pattern. Absolutely. You see it in the Protestant Reformation. You saw it in the Jesus movement of the 70s. And now we are seeing it again.
But here's the thing. Our sources for this deep dive point out, and honestly, it is a fairly radical thesis. They argue that these attempts, they just slide right back into the exact same problems.
Legalism, hierarchy, hypocrisy.
Yes. It's not a revolution, it's a cycle. A cycle of Christian reinvention that never actually reinvents anything.
And what makes today's stack of documents, specifically the Christian complex and Christian self-reinvention, so interesting is that they don't blame the people.
Right. They don't blame the culture or the times.
No. They argue that Christianity is fragile and prone to these schisms because of a fundamental discord within the scripture itself.
A discord in the text.
A massive structural conflict between the teachings of Yeshua Jesus and the theology of Paul. The sources basically argue that until you address that, every fix is just cosmetic.
A facelift on a building with a cracked foundation.
That's the idea.
Wow. Okay, so today we are going to explore this broken logic. We're going to look at why these modern movements trying to be more Hebrew are failing, and why Sunday school might actually be driving kids away from the faith.
And we'll get to a specific mathematical problem the source calls the 6.44%. It challenges a lot of assumptions.
Let's start with that cycle of reinvention. The sources identify a trend that really accelerated in the late 1990s, this explosion of what they call Hebrewish movements.
Hebrewish. It's a very descriptive term, isn't it?
It is.
The texts are referring primarily to the Messianic movement and the Hebrew roots movement. These groups emerged because people were dissatisfied. They felt something was missing from mainstream Protestantism.
They wanted something more authentic.
Something deeper, yeah. But the sources, they're incredibly critical of how this played out. Let's start with the Messianic movement. The tone here really surprised me. The source calls it, and I'm quoting, Protestantism with a dash of schmaltz.
That's a biting critique.
It is. The argument is that the modern version is distinct from its 19th century origins. The source describes it as largely populated by Gentiles who are effectively engaging in cosplay.
Cosplay. You mean like dressing up for a convention?
That is the explicit analogy the text uses. It says these movements are like fans dressing up as aliens for a sci-fi convention. They enjoy the role play, using some Jewish terms, maybe wearing a prayer shawl.
But then they go home.
But then they go home to a normal Western life. It's an appearance of Judaism without the actual function or the community cost of Judaism.
So it's a costume, an aesthetic choice.
Essentially. The source argues if you strip away that Jewish pastiche, that thin veneer, the underlying theology is identical to standard Protestantism. It hasn't solved any of the structural problems.
You've just redecorated the lobby.
Exactly.
The sources also mention intellectual cowardice in the leadership. That's a really strong accusation. What's the basis for that?
It all connects to the canon of Scripture. The source points out that while these groups claim to be returning to the Jewish roots, they accept, without question, the Christian canon defined by early Catholic popes.
Oh, right, like Pope Innocent I?
Precisely. They adopt the aesthetic of the tribe, but refuse to challenge the theology that historically persecuted that tribe. They want the first century vibe, but they're still operating on a 4th century chassis.
Okay, so that's the Messianic side, well-meaning but superficial. But then we get to the Hebrew roots movement. The source seems to frame this as something darker.
Much darker. The Hebrew roots movement often frames itself as the most authentic, trying to correct translations, using the real names of God. You'll hear these endless debates over whether it's Yah or Yahweh.
The source calls it a sacred name obsession.
But it gets darker because of what they call replacement theology. The source argues that while Messianics are like cosplayers, the Hebrew roots movement acts like a stalker.
A stalker, that is a very specific, aggressive image.
It's meant to be. The analogy in the text is vivid. It says they're like a stalker who cuts off a famous painter's hands just to possess their talent.
Oh.
It's described as an act of cultural appropriation or religious fetishism. They want to take the forms of Judaism, the feasts, the names, but they want to replace the Jewish people with themselves.
So they want the inheritance, but they want to evict the family.
Precisely. And that highlights the central failure the source identifies in both movements.
Yeah.
They are neither hot nor cold. They try to adopt Hebrew forms, but they reject the authority of the Hebrew people, the tribe, that preserved those forms.
Which brings us right back to the main thesis. Why do these attempts fail? If people are genuinely searching, why do they end up in this weird limbo?
Because, the source says, they can't reconcile the fundamental discord. You cannot harmonize the historical Yeshua with the theology of Paul. They represent two completely different worlds.
And we usually think of them on the same team. I mean, Paul's usually pitched as the guy who just explained what Jesus did.
That's the traditional narrative. But the source asks us to look at their backgrounds. Yeshua and his disciples were working-class Hebrews, fishermen, not scholars. The source suggests this was intentional to avoid the taint of Hellenism.
And Paul?
Paul is the polar opposite, a Hellenized Jew, fluent in Greek, educated in Platonism. The source argues Platonism was the cornerstone of Roman education, and to a devout Jew of that time, that kind of Greek philosophy was a path to becoming an apikoros.
An apikoros, I've heard that term. It's basically a heretic, right?
Yeah, it comes from Epicurean. It means someone who uses sophisticated arguments to justify not following the law. The source argues Paul synthesized Plato's philosophy with Jewish messianic belief. He created a blend that was totally foreign to the actual disciples of Yeshua.
So you have a Hebrew Messiah teaching Hebrew faithfulness.
And then a Hellenized scholar explaining it all through Greek philosophy. And the source argues these two things are like oil and water. It's not just a vibe difference either. There are specific contradictions.
Right.
Look at Matthew 23.2. This is a crucial text for the source's argument. Yeshua tells his followers, "The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so practice and observe everything they tell you."
Everything they tell you. That sounds like a ringing endorsement of their authority.
It does. Yeshua validates the legal authority of the Pharisees. But Paul and the church fathers who came after him, who were almost entirely ignorant of Hebrew, they rejected this authority completely.
They built a theology where the law was obsolete.
Exactly. And this is where that math comes in.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 6.44% earlier.
Yeah, this number blew my mind when I saw it in the notes.
It is a striking statistic. So if you look at the Christian Bible, the New Testament is only about 23% of the whole book. Paul wrote about 28% of that New Testament.
So if we run the numbers...
That means Paul's writings make up roughly 6.44% of the entire Bible.
Wait, 6.44%?
That's it. And yet the source argues that this 6.44% is used to override and nullify the other 93.6%, including the Old Testament and the actual recorded teachings of Yeshua.
Wow. That really puts it in perspective. It's like a single amendment canceling out the entire Constitution.
It's a good analogy. And it creates a theological house of cards. So how do you defend that?
How does the system defend it?
The defense mechanism is what the source calls dispensationalism.
Right. Dispensationalism. Break that down for everyone.
It's the idea that history is divided into different eras, or dispensations, and the rules change for each one. So the argument goes, the Torah and the Old Testament were true then, but they are obsolete now. We're in a new dispensation of grace.
It sounds convenient, but the source says this creates a logic trap.
A massive one. Because if you say the Old Covenant is obsolete, you have a huge problem with Yeshua. He lived and taught before the crucifixion, he lives under the law, and he taught his disciples to keep the law.
So if the Old Covenant is retired,
then logically, everything Yeshua said before the cross is also retired. It puts the believer in this fog of uncertainty. You have Christians who love Jesus, but their theology tells them his actual instructions are part of the old way that Paul replaced.
that feels like the ground is constantly shifting underneath you.
And it leads to what the text calls an inversion of authority. In Judaism, older means more authoritative because it's closer to the source.
Closer to the mountain, purer the signal.
Correct. But in this model of Christianity, newer is more authoritative. Paul supersedes the Gospels. And the source warns this logic is dangerous because it opens the door for cults.
How so?
Well, if newer means better revelation, then what stops a charismatic leader today from saying, I have a new revelation that supersedes Paul? The source mentions Jim Jones types. When you invert authority, you lose your anchor.
The source gives a modern example of this, right? The pastor, Andy Stanley.
Yes, from North Point Ministries. The source quotes him suggesting that Christians should stop displaying the 10 Commandments because the Old Covenant is retired. He said we need to unhitch the Old Testament.
Retired. We're talking about you shall not murder, you shall not steal.
Exactly. Stanley's argument was that Jesus' covenant replaced the one with Israel. And the source just points out the absurdity. It says this is the logical conclusion of Pauline theology. If the law is dead, Eventually, you end up saying the Ten Commandments don't apply.
And if the fruit of your theology is getting rid of the Ten Commandments?
The source asks, what does that say about the root? It's a diagnostic test.
This brings us to the human cost. Because this isn't just abstract theology. It affects real people. The source talks about the unchurched and the great departure.
It's a massive exodus. The stats mentioned indicate that something like 60% of Christians raised in the church leave as young adults. They just walk out the door.
And here's where it gets so counterintuitive. They talk about the Sunday school syndrome.
This is based on data from Christian apologetics, specifically findings from Ken Ham. He found that kids who faithfully attend Sunday school are actually more likely to leave the faith than those who don't.
Wait, really? You'd assume the ones skipping class are the ones drifting away. Why would education backfire?
The source explains it this way. These kids are raised in a black and white culture. Everything's absolute truth. But because they are in Sunday school, they are actually reading the text.
They're doing the homework.
They're reading the fine print. And when they read deeply, they start seeing these contradictions we've been discussing. They see the discord between Yeshua and Paul. And because they've been taught that it's all perfect or nothing.
The moment they pull on a loose thread, the whole thing just unravels.
It creates cognitive dissonance. And the source argues this leads to the Animal Farm effect.
Animal Farm? Like the Orwell book?
Yes. The argument is that when you remove the objective standard of the Torah law, when you say we are not under law, you don't actually get freedom. You get tyranny.
How does that work? How does no law equal tyranny?
Because a community still needs rules. But now, instead of an objective law that applies to everyone, you have leadership interpreting the spirit. It leads to situational morality. The leaders become the arbiters of right and wrong.
So instead of do not steal, it becomes do not steal unless the leadership says it's for the greater good.
Exactly. The pigs in Animal Farm kept changing the rules on the barn wall. When the law is subjective, the strong rule the weak.
Which explains that list of grievances the source cites from the unchurched.
Hypocrisy, judgment, legalism about feelings instead of actions. The source describes a culture of phony pretense where people have to fake being happy and filled with faith or they get judged. It's an exhausting way to live.
It sounds like walking on eggshells. You have to pretend the contradictions aren't there and you have to pretend you're happy about it.
And deep down, people know that looking too closely causes trouble. So you get this anti-intellectual culture of just believe, don't ask questions, until people just walk away.
They leave not because they want to sin, but because the math doesn't add up.
And they're tired of pretending it does.
Yeah. So where does this leave us? We've got a cycle of failed reinventions, a massive crack in the foundation, and a generation walking away because the logic is broken.
The source summarizes it as an unstable oscillation. The church swings back and forth between tyranny and insanity. It can't fully accept the Tanakh and Yeshua's teaching, because that contradicts Paul, but it can't fully reject them either.
So it's stuck in this uncomfortable limbo.
Exactly. And every time the house shakes, they try to patch the drywall instead of looking at the foundation.
This has been intense, but I think it's a perspective a lot of people haven't considered. We usually think of the Bible as a monolith, one uniform book.
The idea that there's a civil war happening inside the pages explains a lot of the confusion we see on the outside. And it challenges you to ask a very hard question. What's the actual authority in my life? Is it the 93.6% or is it the 6.44% that came later?
That is the question I want to leave everyone with today. Think about that number, 6.44%. If a small fraction of a text is allowed to override the vast majority of it, including the words of the figure the religion is named after, can that structure ever actually be stable? And as the source asks, if the fruits of your theology involve tossing out the Ten Commandments, what does that say about the tree?
It really raises the question of whether the fix is actually the problem.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's a lot to process, but that's what we're here for.
Indeed. Keep asking questions.
Catch you next time.